In the summer of 2015, Europe experienced the highest influx of refugees since the Second World War. Why? The main reason is that Syria has become the world's top source of refugees. Syria is located in the Middle East, an ancient, fertile land settled for at least 10,000 years. Since the 1960s, it's been led by the al-Assad family, who have ruled it as quasi-dictators until the Arab Spring happened in 2011, a revolutionary wave of protests and conflicts in the Arab world that toppled many authoritarian regimes. But the Assads refused to step down and started a brutal civil war. Different ethnicities and religious groups fought each other in changing coalitions. ISIS, a militaristic jihadist group, used the opportunity and entered the chaos with the goal to build a totalitarian Islamic caliphate. The Syrian population was trapped between the regime, rebel groups, and the religious extremists. A third of the Syrian people have been displaced within Syria, while over 4 million have fled the country. The vast majority of them reside now in camps in the neighboring countries who are taking care of 95% of the refugees, while the Arab states of the Persian Gulf together have accepted 0 Syrian refugees, which has been called especially shameful by Amnesty International. The UN and the World Food Programme were not prepared for a refugee crisis on this scale. As a result, many refugee camps are crowded and undersupplied, subjecting people to cold, hunger, and disease. The Syrians lost hope that their situation will be getting better anytime soon, so many decided to seek asylum in Europe. Between 2007 and 2014, the European Union had invested about €2 billion into fences, high-tech security technology and border patrols, but not a lot in preparation for an influx of refugees. So it was badly prepared for the storm of asylum seekers. In the EU, a refugee has to stay in the state they arrived in first, which put enormous pressure on the border states that were already in trouble. Greece, in the midst of an economic crisis on the scale of the Great Depression, was not able to take care of so many people at once, leading to terrible scenes of desperate, hungry people on islands usually reserved for tourists. The world needed to come together and act as a united front, but instead it has become more divided. Many states downright refused to take in any refugees, leaving the border states alone in their struggle. In 2014, the UK lobbied to stop a huge search and rescue operation called Mare Nostrum that was designed to stop asylum seekers from drowning in the Mediterranean. The idea seems to have been that a higher death toll on the sea would mean fewer asylum seekers trying to make the journey. But of course, in reality, that's not what happened. The perception of the crisis around the world suddenly changed when photos circulated of a dead boy from Syria found lying face down on a beach in Turkey. Germany announced that it will, without exception, accept all Syrian refugees and is now preparing to take in 800,000 people in 2015. More than the entire EU took in 2014, only to impose temporary border controls a few days later and demand an EU-wide solution. All over the West, more and more people are beginning to take action, although support for asylum seekers has mostly come from citizens, not from politicians. But there are fears in the Western world: Islam, high birth rates, crime and the collapse of the social systems. Let's acknowledge this and look at the facts. Even if the EU alone were to accept all 4 million Syrian refugees and 100% of them were Muslims, the percentage of Muslims in the European Union would only rise from about 4% to about 5%. This is not a drastic change and will certainly not make it a Muslim continent. A Muslim minority is neither new nor reason to be afraid. Birth rates in many parts of the Western world are low, so some fear asylum seekers might overtake the native population in a few decades. Studies have shown that even though birth rates are higher among Muslims in Europe, they drop and adjust as the standard of living and level of education rises. Most Syrian refugees already are educated. The birth rate in Syria before the civil war was not very high, and the population was actually shrinking, not growing. The fear that refugees lead to higher crime rates also turns out to be wrong. Refugees who become immigrants are less likely to commit crimes than the native population. When allowed to work, they tend to start businesses and integrate themselves into the workforce as fast as possible, paying more into the social systems than they extract from them. Syrians coming to the West are potential professional workers, desperately needed to sustain Europe's aging population. Also, refugees traveling with smartphones has led to the misconception that they're not really in need of help. Social media and the internet have become a vital part of being a refugee. GPS is used to navigate the long routes to Europe. Facebook groups give tips and information about obstacles in real time. This only proves that these people are like us. If you had to make a dangerous journey, would you leave your phone behind?
I'm going into the refugee camp in Dunkirk. Over the past few months, the population here has gone from about 600 to 2,500. It's almost impossible to stay clean in this camp. We're only 20 metres from the main road and already covered in mud. There are only 23 toilets for about 3,000 people and only 2 taps with running water in it.
There's a restriction in place that stops us from bringing any construction material, pallets or tents. Wood that says sort of any bigger than 30 centimetres isn't allowed in. So that's been in place for 2.5 months now. So even though we know what we need to do to improve conditions, we're simply not allowed to do it.
And today the Labour leader made it the priority of his first major foreign trip.
On a human basis, we've all got to reach out. This is a dreadful situation here in this camp.
Conditions in this camp were awful. Ankle-deep mud, open sewers, humanity slowly engulfed by swamp-like conditions, and amid it all, incredibly, children, and lots of them.
It's worse than I expected. The situation is obviously desperate here. It's hard to believe that we're 2016 in modern Europe, 3,000 people living in a sea of mud in inadequate tents.
He feels that the hundreds of British volunteers helping at these camps and in warehouses like this show that public opinion can move.
But you would recognise that many are also in the act of something illegal, which is to try and get into the United Kingdom illegally without papers, and the way to public opinion is that they should be prevented.
I think the way to public opinion is that there should be proper regulation. Therefore, people, of course they shouldn't be entering illegally. Therefore, process the system properly, Britain, France and the other European countries together. And then we wouldn't need to have this camp.
So Umet, where are you from?
خەڵکی کوردستانی باشوورە بڵێ 33 پارچەی بەرتەوە 2 جابرینار بووە هاوان ماین بڵێ بە هاوانیش و بە ماینیش بریندار بووە ئەوە بەریتانیا هاوڕێکەم بەریتانیەکەی ئەوەش ئەمریکی ئەوە بەریتانی هەردوو قاچم بریندار بوو لە شەڕی ناو کۆبانی 2 جار باوەڕم نەبوو بە زیندوی بمێنم لەبەرەوەی شەڕ زۆر گران بوو نەفەر خۆیە تەقاندەوە داعشکا هێرشیانەکەت خۆیانە تەقاندەوە سیارە ئەتەقیەوە خانووە تەقیەوە.
Listen, I met a guy, young guy, in a tent, lovely guy, who clearly would make a fantastic fist of his life. Can't get into Britain because I guess his mum doesn't earn enough money or something like that. She goes over there to take food parcels to him, living in a disgusting tent. She's not a wealthy woman. Young man like that, surely somebody like that deserves to be allowed in.
Why are the conditions here so appalling?
Parce qu'il n'y a pas eu de prise en charge de ces personnes. Et que nous, MSF, en fait, MSF est un acteur surtout à l'international qui n'est pas destiné à travailler en France. Mais face à l'urgence de la situation, on s'est senti obligé d'intervenir parce qu'ici, l'État ne remplissait pas son devoir, on va dire, l'État français.
How should the government respond to the situation in Dunkirk?
La solution est politique, c'est-à-dire aujourd'hui ces gens sont ici pour accéder à l'Angleterre et ils ont besoin de solutions politiques. Ici, ce que nous leur proposons finalement ce sont des solutions de roustine. C'est une roustine où on leur propose des douches, un nouveau camp, etc. Mais ce n'est pas ça qu'ils cherchent en réalité. En réalité, ils cherchent vraiment un asile, une solution politique à leurs problèmes.
I went downstairs, I was leaving the Pentagon, and an officer from the Joint Staff called me into his office and said, I want you to know, he said, sir, we're going to attack Iraq. And I said, why? He said, we don't know. He said, I said, well, did they tie Saddam to 9/11? He said, no. He said, but I guess they don't know what to do about terrorism, and so they think, but they can attack states, and they want to look strong, and so I guess they think if they take down a state, it will intimidate the terrorists. And you know, it's like that old saying, he said, if the only tool you have is a hammer, then every problem has to be a nail. Well, I walked out of there pretty upset. And then we attacked Afghanistan. I was pretty happy about that. We should have. And then I came back to the Pentagon about 6 weeks later. I saw the same officer. I said, why haven't we attacked Iraq? We still going to attack Iraq? He said, oh, sir. He says, it's worse than that. He said, he pulled up a piece of paper off his desk. He said, I just got this memo from the Secretary of Defense's office that says we're going to attack and destroy the governments in 7 countries in 5 years. We're going to start with Iraq, and then we're going to move to Syria, Lebanon, Libya, Somalia, Sudan, and Iran. I said, 7 countries in 5 years. I said, is that a classified memo? He said, yes, sir. And I was bored in the Pentagon, and I thought, I'll just go, who can I see? I think I'll see Wolfowitz. So I called, and up there, he was available. Scooter Libby came to the door. I met Scooter for the first time, and he brought me in. And I said to Paul, I said, and this is 1991, I said, Mr. Secretary, you must be pretty happy with the performance of the troops in Desert Storm. And he said, well, yeah, he said, but not really. He said, because the truth is we should have gotten rid of Saddam Hussein, and we didn't. And this was just after the Shia uprising in March of 91, which we had provoked, and then we kept our troops on the sidelines and didn't intervene. And he said, but one thing we did learn, he said, we learned that we can use our military in the region, in the Middle East, and the Soviets won't stop us. He said, and we've got about 5 or 10 years to clean up those old Soviet client regimes. Syria, Iran, Iraq, before the next great superpower comes on to challenge us. It was a pretty stunning thing. You mean the purpose of the military is to start wars and change governments? It's not to sort of deter conflict? We're going to invade countries? And you know, my mind was spinning. And I put that aside. It was like a nugget that you hold on to. This country was taken over by a group of people with a policy coup. Wolfowitz and Cheney and Rumsfeld, and you could name a half dozen other collaborators from the Project for a New American Century. They wanted us to destabilize the Middle East, turn it upside down.
You outline, or the book outlines, how there's been little change between George W. Bush and Obama, how the US policy all through had little to do with human rights in Syria and much more to do with sponsoring Iraqi-style sectarianism that led us to ISIS and, of course, the refugee crisis, which is making headlines now.
And that's right. If our Syria chapter goes back to 2006. There's a very important cable in 2006 from Ambassador Roebuck, stationed in Damascus. And he writes back discussing a plan for the overthrow of the Assad government in Syria. And that plan is not, well, we should, you know, support the opposition and so on through better media planning and so on. It's to use a number of different factors to create paranoia within the Syrian government, to push it to overreact, to make it fear that there's a coup.
This man Roebuck, now ambassador to Bahrain, so caught there, deliberately trying to foster the kind of destruction that's led to the refugee crisis.
I mean, there's a number of cables speaking about it in the Syrian chapter, but that particular cable, it is really quite concerning. I mean, you know, often cables are written in such a way where you have to read between the lines or look what is not said. In this particular cable, it's just all hanging out, a whole lot of Machiavellian schemes to overthrow the Syrian government.
With international pressure mounting on Syria each day, is there a danger that we could be heading for a repeat of Libyan events, or are the situations in the two countries very different?
The situations in the two countries are very similar. Both the events in Libya and Syria have been orchestrated by the same people. One of them is and organizations, including the National Endowment for Democracy. In fact, the people who have started these problems and the destabilization of Syria are the same people who started in Libya.
Ramsey Clark, who served as U.S. Attorney General under former President Lyndon Johnson, says it's plain that the West is trying to overthrow Syria.
Historic Syria, prosperous Syria, being devastated deliberately by foreign design, backed by the powers that want to dominate the region.
We also need to remember what is the cause of these hundreds of thousands of refugees and economic migrants. There are issues around climate change. There are issues around instability. But above all, there are issues around a series of ill-fated Western military interventions in Libya, in Iraq, and across the Middle East.
You look down the line at Syria, you look down the line at the millions of refugees around the world, you look at those desperate people in Libya, you look at those desperate people trying to get across the Mediterranean, you look at those desperate people in Calais. None of this is simple. I'm not pretending there's an easy answer to anything. There isn't. But, and this is a big but, do we approach the issues of the world on the basis of our ability to militarily invade and intervene? Or do we instead approach it on the basis that we're all human beings on one planet? We're all there to support fellow humanity.